I came to visit my son on Thanksgiving Day, but he coldly said, "Dad, you're not welcome here. We only invited my in-laws." I quietly left, hiding the pain of betrayal. A month later, he called me in a panic because his perfect life with his rich in-laws had fallen apart like a house of cards. You won't believe what I did. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I dialed Glenn's number before I could change my mind. The mahogany desk felt solid under my elbows as I waited for him to answer, watching November light dance across the lake through my study window. Martha's empty chair sat by the fireplace, still angled toward mine from our last conversation. "Hey, Dad." Glenn's voice sounded distant, distracted. "Son, I wanted to talk about Thanksgiving. I've been planning the menu, and I thought we could try Martha's sage stuffing recipe this year. The one Dad, we're hosting at our place this year. Everything's already decided." The words hit like cold water. My pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the open notebook where I'd written guest lists in careful columns. "What do you mean, decided?" "Ember's parents are flying in from Phoenix. We've already made reservations, ordered the turkey. It's all handled." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, searching for warmth in his tone. Found none. "But we always host here. This house has seen 43 Thanksgivings. Your mother loved—" "That was Mom's thing, Dad, not mine." The notebook pages fluttered in the draft from the heating vent. Each page showed years of careful planning. Guest counts, menu adjustments, dietary restrictions noted in Martha's neat handwriting for the last time just 2 years ago. Before the diagnosis. Before everything changed. I don't understand. "Last year you said—" "Last year was different. Ember's parents couldn't travel then. This year they can, so we're doing it right. Professional catering, proper dining room, the whole thing." "Right?" The word tasted bitter. "What does that mean?" Static crackled through the connection. In the background, I heard Ember's voice, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out words. Glenn covered the phone, muffled conversation bleeding through. "Look, Dad, I've got to run. We're meeting the caterers in 20 minutes. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, its black surface reflecting the lake's gray water. The silence stretched, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the dock where Martha used to sit with her morning coffee. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten beside the planning materials that suddenly seemed pointless. 43 years. Martha had counted them once during her last Thanksgiving. Weak but determined to make one more perfect meal, she'd stood in this very room, leaning against the doorframe because standing hurt too much, and told me how proud she was of our traditions. The notebook lay open to this year's page. At the top, in my careful engineer's script, November 28th, 2024, Thomas and Glenn Miller Family Thanksgiving. Below it, columns of planned dishes, timing schedules, shopping lists, all worthless now. I closed the notebook and walked to the living room where Martha's chair waited. Martha's chair embraced me like an old friend. The leather still held the faint impression of her smaller frame, still carried the ghost of her apple cinnamon scent. I pulled the photo album from the side table, its weight familiar in my hands. The first picture showed Martha at 26, flour dusting her dark hair as she attempted my grandmother's dinner rolls. The kitchen looked different then. Yellow wallpaper instead of the sage green Martha chose later. She was laughing at something I'd said, her eyes bright with the challenge of mastering family recipes. "These rolls are terrible," she'd announced that first Thanksgiving, holding up a dense, misshapen lump. "But I'll master them if it kills me." It took her 3 years. By the fourth Thanksgiving, her rolls were better than my grandmother's had ever been. I turned the page. Glenn at 8, standing on a kitchen stool, carefully spooning cranberry sauce into serving bowls. His tongue poked out in concentration, the same expression he'd worn building Lego cities or working math problems. Martha stood behind him, hands ready to catch him if he wobbled. "Can I make the gravy next year, Mom? Dad lets me use the whisk." "If you practice," Martha had promised. No lumps allowed at the Miller table. The next photo captured Glenn at 16, taller than Martha now, arm around her shoulders as they posed by the dining room table. The good china gleamed under candlelight, the turkey golden and perfect. Glenn's face showed that awkward teenage pride, old enough to appreciate the work, but young enough to take it for granted. That was the year he'd brought Sarah Mitchell, his first serious girlfriend. Martha had fussed for weeks, polishing silver that was already spotless, practicing conversation topics that wouldn't embarrass him. After dinner, I'd found her in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. "Happy tears," she'd insisted when I asked. "He's growing up so beautifully." Sarah had broken up with him 2 weeks later, but Martha's joy had lasted months. The final photo in the sequence showed last year's table. Martha sat at her usual place, the cashmere scarf hiding what the chemotherapy had taken. But her smile remained brilliant, her hands steady as she carved the turkey with the precision of decades of practice. Glenn sat beside Ember, both of them checking their phones periodically, but present, still present. "This might be my last one," Martha had whispered to me while washing dishes later. "Make sure the traditions continue. Make sure Glenn remembers what matters." I'd promised her. Standing in our kitchen with soap bubbles clinging to my hands, I'd sworn that our family's Thanksgiving would survive whatever came next. The photo album slipped from my lap as I reached for the fireplace poker. The flames needed stirring, but my hands shook too badly to manage it. The house felt enormous around me, every empty room echoing with conversations that would never happen again. Martha's presence lingered strongest here in her chair, surrounded by the life we'd built together. But even that was fading now, dissolving like morning mist over the lake. Soon there would be nothing left but memories, and apparently even those weren't worth preserving. I closed the album and set it aside. Max whined from his bed by the fireplace, sensing my mood with the supernatural awareness of old dogs. His tail thumped once against the hearthstones. "Come on, boy," I said, standing with effort that surprised me. "Let's take a walk before dark." The collar jingled as Max stretched and padded toward the back door, leaving me alone with the photographs and the growing certainty that everything I'd cherished was already gone. Morning frost crunched under my boots as Max and I followed our usual path around Lakewood Park. The golden retriever trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back to check my mood, with the intuitive concern of a creature who'd watched me grieve for 11 months. Yesterday's conversation with Glenn felt different in daylight. Less like betrayal, more like change I needed to accept. Problems required solutions. My engineering background had taught me that much. Resistance created stress fractures. Adaptation ensured survival. Perhaps Glenn was right to move forward, to build new traditions with Ember's family. Martha wouldn't want me clinging to the past at everyone else's expense. The lake stretched before us, mirror smooth in the November stillness. Other early walkers nodded as they passed, the retired teacher with her ancient beagle, the young father pushing a stroller. Normal people adapting to normal changes. I could do this. My phone buzzed against my chest. The caller ID showed Ember's name, surprising me enough that I nearly fumbled the device before answering. "Tommy!" Her voice rang with the forced enthusiasm she used to try to sound caring. "Glenn and I would like to invite you to our Thanksgiving dinner on Thursday. We'd love to see you, and we'll be there at 2 o'clock sharp. Don't be late. You know how Fred is about punctuality." She laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "And dress nice, okay? We're gonna take a lot of pictures this year." Hope shone through me like the sunrise after a long night. That was it. Now I was sure that Glenn hadn't forgotten to invite me, but just wanted to do it after determining the exact time the celebration would start. Ember was calling to include me, to make sure I felt welcome in their new tradition. "Of course," I answered, my voice thick with gratitude. "Should I bring anything special? Wine? Flowers?" "Oh, Tommy, you're so sweet. Just come by yourself. Glenn takes care of everything else. He's very particular about his parties." Parties. Not a family dinner, but I could adapt. It was important to be together, to honor Martha's memory while staying in touch with Glenn. She would have approved of this flexibility. "I'll be there at 2, I promised. "Thank you for calling, Ember. It means a lot to me. See you Thursday." The line went dead, but the warmth lingered. Max had stopped to investigate something fascinating in the grass, tail wagging as he marked his territory, life continuing in its essential patterns. I looked across the water toward home, calculating what needed doing. A good bottle of wine from the cellar, something impressive but not ostentatious. My navy suit, the one Martha had helped me choose for Glenn's wedding. A week to prepare mentally for meeting Ember's parents, for navigating new family dynamics with grace. The walk home felt lighter than it had in months. Max seemed to sense the change, bounding ahead with renewed energy, occasionally circling back to ensure I was keeping pace. Even the November air felt less harsh, carrying promises of warmth waiting indoors, problems and solutions. Martha had always said I was at my best when I had something to fix, something to build. Now I had a new project, learning to be the father-in-law Ember's parents deserved, the family member Glenn needed me to become. The house welcomed us back with familiar creaks and settling sounds. I unleashed Max by the back door, watching him trot toward his water bowl with the satisfaction of a morning well spent. The kitchen clock showed 8:45, plenty of time to plan properly. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. The week crawled by in careful preparation. I selected a bottle of 1998's Chateau Margaux from Martha's collection, wrapped it in tissue paper that whispered against itself like secrets. My navy suit hung pressed and ready, shoes polished to mirror brightness. I rehearsed conversations with Ember's parents, practiced gracious responses to questions about retirement, about adjusting to widower life. Thursday arrived crisp and clear. By 1:30, I was walking up the brick pathway to Glenn's house in Maplewood Heights, the expensive wine cradled in my arms like an offering. The neighborhood screamed success: manicured lawns, 3-car garages, security systems blinking green from every doorframe. Cars lined the circular driveway. A silver Mercedes, a black BMW, Glenn's practical Honda looking humble beside them. I knocked firmly, arranging my face into the welcoming expression I'd practiced. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal Glenn in a pressed khaki pants and sweater vest, looking like he'd stepped from a catalog page. His face went white. "Dad?" "Right on time," I said, lifting the wine bottle slightly. 2:00, just like Ember said. Glenn's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Behind him, I caught glimpses of the dining room, white tablecloth, crystal glasses catching afternoon light, 5 place settings arranged with military precision. 5, Dad, He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped onto the porch, pulling the door nearly closed behind him. "I forgot to call you back." The words hung between us like suspended glass, ready to shatter. "Call me back?" "After Ember talked to you, we decided—" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We wanted to celebrate with just Ember's parents this year. Family only. Family only." The phrase hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. "I'm your family." Glenn could not meet my eyes. From inside the house came laughter, the clinking of crystal, voices in a celebration I could never be a part of. The Mercedes apparently belonged to Fred and Samantha Green, Ember's real family, the ones to impress. "It's complicated, Dad. Fred gave us a 2-story house 3 days ago, and I've already signed the deed to it, and we have nothing to thank you for this year because you were depressed and living in the past." It was as if the Miller family's 43 years of celebrating Thanksgiving were practice runs, inadequate rehearsals for the real holiday and the real gifts. I looked down at the wine in my hands. A bottle cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month, and felt stupid. "Since Mom died, you've been—" Glenn tried to find the words, settling on the cruelest possible option. "You've been falling apart. We thought it would be easier. Falling apart." As if grief were a personal failure, as if losing Marta meant I was broken beyond repair. The bottle of wine shook in my hand. "I prepared for this," I said quietly. "I bought wine. I pressed my suit. I know, and I'm sorry. Really. Maybe next year we can work something out." Next year. Another promise as empty as the space where I should have been sitting at their table. Glenn was already backing toward the door, eager to return to his real celebration with his real family. "Keep the wine," I said, setting the bottle on the porch step. "Give it to Fred. I'm sure he'll appreciate the vintage." I turned away before Glenn could respond, walking back down the brick pathway with measured steps that cost me everything I had. Behind me, the door closed with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot. The Mercedes gleamed in the driveway, pristine and expensive. Through the dining room window, I glimpsed Ember laughing at something an older man in a suit was saying, her father, presumably, the one whose approval mattered more than 43 years of family tradition. I reached my car and sat motionless, hands resting on the steering wheel. From inside Glenn's house came the muffled sound of celebration, a family gathering the way families should, just not with me. The wine bottle sat abandoned on the porch step, reflecting November light like a beacon of everything I'd lost. I sat in my car outside Lakewood Shopping Center, engine silent, hands still trembling around the steering wheel. The wine bottle rested in the passenger seat like an accusation, its burgundy label catching reflections from the overhead lights. Families streamed past my windows, loaded with last-minute Thanksgiving supplies, their conversations muffled but unmistakably warm. 45 minutes had passed since Glenn closed his door on me, since he chose Fred Green's money over 43 years of Miller family traditions. My engineering mind began working despite the emotional numbness. Problems required analysis before solutions emerged. I'd been treating Glenn's behavior as grief-induced distance, but the evidence suggested something far more calculated. The missed visits during Martha's chemotherapy sessions. I'd made excuses, work pressure, Ember's schedule conflicts, but Glenn had found time for weekend golf trips, for dinner parties with Ember's colleagues. He'd attended exactly 3 of Martha's 27 treatment appointments, the inheritance conversations that started 6 months before Martha's death. Dad, have you updated your will lately? Casual questions about the house value, about my retirement accounts. I'd answered honestly, touched by what I'd interpreted as concern for my well-being. Martha had noticed. He's changing, she'd whispered one evening after Glenn cut short a visit to attend some work function. Money makes people different, Thomas. Promise me you'll be careful. I'd dismissed her concerns as chemotherapy-induced paranoia. Martha saw threats everywhere during those final months. In doctors' expressions, in insurance paperwork, in Glenn's increasingly brief phone calls. I'd attributed her worries to medication side effects. How blind I'd been. The shopping center buzzed with normal families preparing normal celebrations. A grandfather helped his grandson load a turkey into their car, both of them laughing at something I couldn't hear. The boy looked about 8, Glenn's age in my favorite photograph, the one where he stood on tiptoes to reach the cranberry sauce. That child was gone, had been gone for years probably. The man who'd blocked his own father's entrance to Thanksgiving dinner was someone else entirely. Someone who viewed our relationship through a balance sheet rather than a heart. The whiskey bottle seemed to mock me. $300 spent on a gesture Glenn would never appreciate, never even understand. He'd probably serve it to Fred Green, mentioning casually that his father had dropped by unannounced with a gift. My chest ached with something deeper than embarrassment. This was betrayal in its purest form, not the dramatic kind that happened in movies, but the slow erosion of love through calculation and convenience. Glenn hadn't set out to hurt me. He'd simply decided I wasn't worth the effort anymore. The realization brought clarity instead of tears. Martha had left me more than memories. She'd left me resources, independence, the power to make choices about my own future instead of waiting for Glenn to remember his obligations. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the whiskey on the passenger seat where it belonged, as evidence of my last attempt at reconciliation. The drive home took exactly 18 minutes, time enough to decide that some relationships, once broken, weren't worth repairing. The house welcomed me back with familiar creaks and settling sounds. I let Max out into the backyard, made fresh coffee, and checked the mail. Normal routines that helped my engineer's mind transition from shock to strategy. By 6:30, the November darkness had settled around the windows, making the study feel like a sanctuary rather than a prison. I opened the safe behind my desk with steady hands. The documents inside represented 40 years of careful planning, insurance policies, investment statements, property deeds, everything Martha and I had built together, everything we'd intended to pass down to family who would honor our memory. The will rested on top, its legal language as precise as any blueprint I'd ever drafted. Current beneficiary designation, Glenn Miller, sole heir. The numbers told their own story. House valued at $850,000. Savings accounts totaling $420,000. Life insurance payout of $300,000. Nearly $1.5 million waiting for someone who couldn't spare 2 hours for Thanksgiving dinner. I studied the document with the same attention I'd once given to structural engineering problems. Martha and I had updated it 3 years ago when Glenn married Ember. We'd been so proud then, so confident in our son's character. The will reflected our optimism. Everything to Glenn, with provisions for grandchildren we'd hoped would come. Now those provisions felt like wishful thinking, from naive parents who'd believed blood meant loyalty. The legal language was straightforward enough. Beneficiaries could be changed with proper documentation and witnesses. The process would take exactly one appointment with Walter Thompson, my attorney and oldest friend. Walter had handled our legal needs for 20 years. He'd understand the necessity without requiring detailed explanations. Glenn would never suspect the change. Children rarely asked about wills until after funerals, assuming their inheritance was guaranteed by genetics rather than affection. He'd continue planning his future around money he'd already lost, making decisions based on resources that would disappear the moment my heart stopped beating. The irony was perfect. If Glenn wanted to treat our relationship like a business transaction, we'd play by business rules. If he needed only money from his father, he'd discover exactly what that relationship was worth. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes. Not revenge, justice. Martha had built this wealth alongside me through decades of shared sacrifice. She'd worried about Glenn's changing priorities during her final months. This decision honored her concerns while protecting everything we'd worked to create. The new beneficiary would require careful consideration. Walter's law firm handled charitable trusts. There were options for educational foundations, medical research, community development projects, organizations that would use Miller family wealth to help people who actually needed assistance rather than funding more luxury vacations and status symbols. Glenn would learn about the change, eventually, of course, probably at the reading of my will, whenever that day came. I imagined his expression when Walter announced that the Miller family fortune had been redirected to benefit strangers rather than an ungrateful son. The thought brought me more satisfaction than it probably should have. But satisfaction felt better than humiliation, and planning felt infinitely better than helpless acceptance. I closed the safe but left the will on my desk, next to Martha's photograph. She smiled at me from the silver frame, her eyes bright with the intelligence that had recognized Glenn's transformation before I did. "You were right about him," I told her quietly. "But you'd be proud of what happens next." Outside, wind rattled the November trees, but inside the study, everything felt perfectly calm. Thompson, Bradley and Associates occupied the 4th floor of Lakewood's only downtown high-rise, its brass nameplate gleaming under fluorescent lights that had witnessed 40 years of legal consultations. I rode the elevator up on Tuesday morning, 3 days after Thanksgiving, carrying a manila folder containing documents that would reshape my family's future forever. Walter Thompson's secretary ushered me into his corner office at exactly 10 o'clock. 20 years of friendship had earned me punctuality, if nothing else. Walter rose from behind his mahogany desk, smaller than mine at home, but covered with the organized chaos of active legal practice. "Tom." He gripped my hand with the firm shake of someone who'd built trust through decades of honest work. "You sounded serious on the phone. I need to change my will, Walter. Complete restructuring." His eyebrows rose slightly. At 65, Walter had handled enough family drama to recognize the signs, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "That's a significant decision. Mind if I ask what prompted this?" I settled into the leather client chair, feeling its familiar comfort. This office had hosted Martha's will preparation, our house purchases, even Glenn's adoption paperwork 30 years ago. Now, it would serve a different purpose entirely. "Family circumstances have changed," I said carefully. "I want to establish a charitable foundation instead of individual inheritance." Walter reached for his legal pad, pen already moving. "The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation?" Exactly. The name had come to me during the weekend planning sessions. Martha would have approved of helping others rather than funding ingratitude. "Tom, this is a significant change. Are you certain about this?" "I've never been more certain about anything, Walter." He studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd guided clients through difficult decisions. "What about Glenn? He's been your sole beneficiary for 20 years. "Glenn will be fine. He's made other arrangements for his financial future." Walter's pen paused. "Does he know about this change?" "No, and I want it kept confidential until necessary." "Can the foundation be established without his knowledge?" "Absolutely. Client confidentiality covers all estate planning decisions." Walter made additional notes. What focus areas do you want for the foundation? Education, medical research, community development? I'd considered this question extensively. Educational scholarships for engineering students. Martha always said education was the best investment in someone's future. Excellent choice. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation for Engineering Education. Walter wrote the name across the top of a fresh page. We'll need to establish the foundation structure first, then modify your will to designate it as primary beneficiary. The paperwork took 2 hours: articles of incorporation, foundation bylaws, beneficiary designations. Walter's expertise guided me through legal language that would protect Martha's memory while serving students who actually valued education. The foundation will be official within 10 business days, Walter explained as I signed the final documents. Your will modification takes effect immediately upon notarization. I watched the notary seal stamp my signature, feeling lighter than I had since Thanksgiving. Justice wore legal robes and carried official seals, but it still counted as justice. Tom, can I ask one more question as your friend rather than your attorney? Of course. Are you doing this for the right reasons? Charity work should come from generosity, not anger. I considered his concerns seriously. Walter deserved honesty, even if not complete disclosure. I'm doing this because Martha built this wealth alongside me. She'd want it used to help people who appreciate opportunities rather than take them for granted. Walter nodded slowly. That sounds like Martha talking. She always was the practical one in your marriage. I left his office carrying copies of documents that would surprise Glenn eventually, but not until after my funeral. By then, he'd have had years to appreciate the consequences of choosing money over family. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying me toward a future where my legacy would outlive my disappointments. December arrived with early snow and the comfortable routine of holiday preparations. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation existed now, officially incorporated and waiting to receive everything I'd worked 40 years to accumulate. Glenn remained unaware of his vanished inheritance, planning his future around wealth that no longer belonged to him. I met Walter for lunch at Lake Grill on December 22nd, our traditional pre-Christmas meal stretching back 15 years. The restaurant overlooked the frozen lake where Martha and I had taken countless winter walks. Today, ice fishermen dotted the surface like patient sentinels. Foundation paperwork is complete, Walter said, cutting into his salmon. You'll receive quarterly reports on scholarship distributions starting next year. Excellent. Any interesting applicants so far? Several promising engineering students from Colorado State. Martha would be proud of the caliber of candidates. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of plans properly executed. The foundation would help deserving students while keeping my wealth away from someone who'd proven unworthy of it. Walter set down his fork, expression shifting to professional concern. Speaking of legal matters, I had an interesting consultation request last week. Fred Green asked me to represent him. The name hit me like cold water. Fred Green? You know him? I kept my voice carefully neutral. I've heard the name. What kind of representation? Financial fraud investigation. Federal prosecutors are building a case against his development company. Walter shook his head. I declined due to ethical concerns. His situation looks quite serious. My engineering mind started connecting circuits. Fred Green was Ember's father, the man whose approval had mattered more to Glenn than 43 years of Miller family traditions. If Fred needed criminal defense representation, what kind of fraud? I asked. Walter glanced around the restaurant, ensuring our conversation remained private. Investment schemes, apparently, promising high returns on development projects that never existed. Classic Ponzi structure, using new investor money to pay earlier clients. The pieces aligned with mechanical precision. Fred's expensive gifts to Glenn and Ember, the Mercedes in their driveway, the generous father-in-law who'd impressed them enough to abandon family traditions. How much money are we talking about? According to preliminary reports, somewhere north of $2 million. He's been operating the scheme for approximately 18 months. 18 months. That timeline covered Glenn's marriage celebration period, when he'd started mentioning Ember's successful parents and their investment opportunities. Had Glenn and Ember received money from Fred's criminal enterprise? Had they unknowingly become beneficiaries of fraud? When did this investigation begin? I asked. FBI involvement started in October, but the Colorado Attorney General's office has been watching his company since last summer. Financial crimes move slowly until they accelerate rapidly. October, before Thanksgiving, before Glenn had chosen Fred's approval over his own father's traditions. While I'd been planning menus and organizing family celebrations, federal prosecutors had been building a case against my son's preferred father figure. The irony was almost too perfect. Glenn had sacrificed our relationship for association with a criminal. Ember's family wealth was built on stolen money. The Thanksgiving celebration that had excluded me was funded by fraud. Walter continued eating, unaware of the family drama his information had illuminated. I referred Fred to criminal defense specialists in Denver. His situation requires expertise I don't provide. What happens to assets acquired through fraud proceeds? Civil forfeiture, typically. If prosecutors can prove property was purchased with stolen money, it gets seized regardless of current ownership status. I thought about Glenn's house, about the expensive gifts Fred had lavished on his daughter and son-in-law. If those purchases came from fraud proceeds, Glenn might face legal complications beyond simple disappointment. Interesting case, I said, maintaining conversational neutrality. Sounds like Fred's family might face difficult times ahead. Walter nodded grimly. Financial crime affects entire families. Children, spouses, even close associates can find themselves under scrutiny. The ripple effects extend far beyond the primary perpetrator. I finished my lunch with new information that changed everything about Glenn's situation. My son hadn't just chosen money over family loyalty. He'd chosen criminal money. The justice I'd achieved through foundation establishment was about to be supplemented by federal law enforcement. Sometimes the universe provided its own revenge, more thorough than anything I could have planned alone. The parking garage elevator carried me down 3 floors, while my engineering mind assembled the pieces Walter had inadvertently provided. Fred Green, the impressive father-in-law, who'd convinced Glenn to abandon family traditions, was a criminal facing federal prosecution. The Mercedes in Glenn's driveway, the expensive gifts, the generous family holidays, all funded by stolen money. I drove home through December streets decorated with holiday lights, each twinkling bulb reminding me of Christmases when Glenn had valued family over status. That version of my son had vanished gradually, replaced by someone who measured relationships through balance sheets rather than love. The house welcomed me back with familiar warmth. I made fresh coffee and settled in my study, where foundation documents waited on the mahogany desk like proof of better choices. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation had already distributed its first scholarships to 3 engineering students whose gratitude letters sat beside the legal paperwork. Fred's situation created an interesting moral equation. My son had chosen wealthy in-laws over his own father, believing their financial success would secure his future. Now those same in-laws threatened to destroy everything Glenn had worked to build. The irony was mathematically perfect. I could warn Glenn about Fred's troubles. A simple phone call would alert him to investigate his financial arrangements, possibly saving him from whatever schemes Fred had orchestrated. The loving father I'd been 6 months ago would have made that call immediately, but loving fathers deserved loving sons in return. Glenn had demonstrated clearly where his loyalties resided. When forced to choose between family traditions and impressive in-laws, he'd selected money over memory. When faced with honoring Martha's legacy or impressing Fred Green, he'd chosen status over sentiment. Natural consequences made excellent teachers. Glenn had chosen his path deliberately, dismissing my concerns and my feelings in favor of Fred's approval. If that decision carried hidden costs, perhaps those costs would provide education that fatherly advice had failed to deliver. I opened the foundation files and reviewed progress reports. 3 students now had full scholarships thanks to Martha's memory. Next year, there would be more. The money Glenn had counted on inheriting was already helping people who appreciated opportunities rather than expecting them. Fred's legal troubles would resolve themselves through federal prosecutors and defense attorneys. Glenn's financial complications would teach him lessons about trusting the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Neither situation required my intervention or my emotional investment. The coffee grew cold while I calculated the elegant justice unfolding without my participation. Glenn had wanted independence from family obligations. He was about to receive exactly what he'd requested, along with comprehensive education about the difference between family wealth and criminal proceeds. I filed the foundation papers in their proper folder and closed the desk drawer. Martha smiled at me from her silver frame, her expression warm with approval. She'd always understood that some mistakes required personal experience rather than parental prevention. Outside, snow began falling against the study windows, each flake catching lamplight like tiny stars. The winter evening felt peaceful and complete, unmarred by obligations to ungrateful children or concern for consequences they'd chosen to create. Tomorrow would bring whatever developments Fred's troubles had generated. Tonight belonged to quiet satisfaction and the comfort of decisions made with careful thought rather than emotional impulse. Justice served itself when people understood its requirements clearly enough to step aside and let it work. Christmas Eve approached with the gentle routine of holiday preparations, unmarked by family complications. I spent Monday evening addressing greeting cards to friends, organizing gifts for charitable distribution, and reviewing foundation applications that would distribute next year's scholarships. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation had grown beyond my initial expectations, attracting additional donations from community members who'd known Martha's generous spirit. Dinner consisted of leftover soup and fresh bread, eaten while reading engineering journals by the fireplace. Max dozed contentedly on his favorite rug, occasionally twitching through dreams that probably involved chasing lake ducks. The house felt complete and purposeful, no longer echoing with emptiness or regret. My phone rang at 7:45, interrupting an article about sustainable bridge design. Glenn's name appeared on the caller ID, surprising me enough that I considered letting it go to voicemail. Curiosity won over caution. "Dad!" His voice carried panic I'd never heard before, even during his worst childhood crises. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." "What's wrong, Glenn?" Fred deceived me. The house, the gifts, everything was a lie. Words tumbled over each other in desperate rush. "I'm in serious financial trouble, and I don't know what to do." I leaned back in Martha's chair, feeling strangely calm despite Glenn's obvious distress. "Slow down and explain clearly." "The house Fred gave us isn't actually a gift. It comes with massive monthly payments I can't afford. Payments he never mentioned when we signed the papers. The mortgage, the maintenance fees, the property taxes. It's more than my entire salary." "You signed documents without reading them?" Fred said it was just formality paperwork for the gift transfer. He handled everything through his company's lawyers. I trusted him completely. Glenn's voice cracked with strain. "Now I understand it was all a setup to trap us in debt." The engineering problem solver in me automatically began calculating implications, while the father in me remained carefully neutral. "What exactly did you sign?" "Everything. Mortgage guarantees, personal liability agreements, maintenance contracts. Fred structured it, so we're responsible for costs that total nearly $8,000 monthly. We can't afford it, but we can't get out of it without losing everything we've put into the house." $8,000 monthly. Glenn's IT salary probably covered half that amount, leaving him completely dependent on sources he'd assumed were generous gifts rather than calculated traps. "Have you spoken to an attorney?" "I can't afford one. Every penny goes to keeping up with these payments." Ember's beside herself. Her parents have disappeared, won't return calls, won't explain anything. Glenn's breathing sounded ragged. "Dad, I made a terrible mistake choosing them over you. I realize that now. Can you help me?" The question hung between us like suspended weight. 6 months ago, I would have responded immediately with whatever assistance Glenn needed. Tonight, I felt only analytical detachment and mild curiosity about how far his desperation extended. "Help you how?" "Financially. A loan to cover the payments until I can figure out legal options. Or advice. You always knew how to solve complicated problems." His voice dropped to barely above whisper. "I'm sorry about Thanksgiving. I'm sorry about everything. I know I hurt you badly. Sorry." The word carried less weight than I'd expected. Apologies offered during crisis rarely reflected genuine understanding, only desperate attempts to access resources that suddenly seemed necessary. "This is quite a situation, Glenn. I need time to consider what might be possible." Silence stretched through the connection. Glenn had probably expected immediate rescue, the way I'd always provided solutions during his childhood difficulties. Adult problems required adult solutions, particularly when those problems resulted from adult choices made against explicit parental advice. "How much time?" he asked finally. "I'll call you back when I've had opportunity to think it through properly." I ended the call before Glenn could argue or plead further. The study felt exactly as peaceful as it had before the interruption, unchanged by knowledge of my son's financial catastrophe. Fred's scheme had worked perfectly, just not in the direction Glenn had anticipated. The impressive father-in-law had indeed provided education about wealth and status, specifically about the difference between earning respect and buying it. Martha's photograph caught lamplight as I returned the phone to its cradle. Her expression seemed amused rather than sympathetic, as if she'd anticipated this conversation long before I had. Outside, snow continued falling through the December darkness, covering everything in clean whiteness that would last until morning brought whatever complications tomorrow chose to deliver. Christmas star, calf, buzzed with holiday morning energy when I arrived at 9 o'clock, carrying a manila folder that would complete my understanding of Glenn's situation. Walter sat in our usual corner booth, surrounded by legal documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd worked through Christmas Eve morning to accommodate an urgent client request. "Tom, this better be important. Helen's expecting me home by 11 for gift wrapping." I slid into the booth opposite him, noting the careful organization of papers that marked Walter's professional thoroughness. "I need complete details about Fred Green's legal troubles. Everything you can share professionally." Walter's eyebrows rose. "That's oddly specific. May I ask why?" "Family reasons. I can't explain more without compromising confidentialities. But I need to understand exactly what Fred did and who might be affected." "Fair enough." Walter opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick file. Fred Green orchestrated a sophisticated debt transfer scheme disguised as generous gifts to family members. The FBI investigation reveals he moved his company's massive liabilities onto unsuspecting relatives through fraudulent property transfers. How does that work legally? Simple but effective. Fred would gift expensive properties to family members, but the gift documents contained hidden mortgage obligations, maintenance contracts, and personal liability guarantees. Recipients signed without reading, trusting the generous benefactor. Walter shook his head grimly. The victims become legally responsible for debts they never knew existed. I felt the final puzzle piece click into place. Glenn's house gift wasn't generosity. It was Fred's method of transferring his failing company's debts onto someone else's shoulders. What recourse do victims have? Limited. If they sign the documents, they're legally bound unless they can prove fraud or coercion. Given Fred's careful construction of the paperwork, that's extremely difficult to establish. Walter pulled out specific documents showing Fred's company obligations. Green Development owes approximately $2.8 million to various creditors. Fred transferred roughly half that amount to family members through these fake gift schemes. So the recipients inherit debt instead of assets? Precisely. They believe they're receiving valuable property when they're actually accepting financial liabilities that will destroy them. Walter's professional demeanor couldn't hide his disgust. It's particularly cruel because it exploits family trust. I studied the timeline Walter provided. Fred had been executing this scheme for over a year, carefully selecting targets who would sign documents without legal review. Glenn's naive trust had made him a perfect mark. When will the FBI move on this? Soon. They're building cases against both Fred and the family members who knowingly participated, though I suspect most victims were genuinely deceived rather than complicit. Most victims. That phrase suggested some people might have understood the scheme, but participated anyway. Had Glenn suspected anything? Had his enthusiasm for Fred's generosity included willful blindness to obvious red flags? What happens to the transferred properties? Civil forfeiture if purchased with fraud proceeds. The families lose everything they thought they'd gained, plus face liability for the underlying debts Fred transferred. Walter gathered his papers. It's a complete financial catastrophe for anyone involved. I thanked Walter and left the CAF with comprehensive understanding of Glenn's situation. My son hadn't just chosen money over family. He'd chosen criminal money that would ultimately destroy him. The poetic justice was almost too perfect to believe. The drive home took me past Glenn's neighborhood, where expensive houses stood like monuments to misplaced priorities. Behind those impressive facades, families faced financial ruin because they'd trusted the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Glenn had made his choice on Thanksgiving Day. Now he would live with every consequence that choice had created, without assistance from the father he'd abandoned. Justice sometimes wore federal badges and carried legal documents, but it still counted as justice. 9 days passed in quiet satisfaction. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation distributed its first cancer family assistance grants, helping 3 families cover treatment costs that insurance wouldn't touch. Martha would have approved of the practical help, reaching people who faced the same battles we'd fought together. Glenn called twice more during the holiday week, each conversation shorter and more desperate than the last. I listened politely to his escalating panic about mounting bills and legal complications, offering sympathy but no solutions. He'd created this crisis through his own choices. He could resolve it through the same agency. New Year's Day brought reflection on my transformation from grieving widower to strategic architect of justice. 12 months ago, I'd been planning Martha's final Thanksgiving, desperately hoping Glenn would spend time with his dying mother. Today, I sat in my study, reviewing foundation documents that proved grief could be channeled into purpose rather than consumed by bitterness. The doorbell rang at 4 o'clock on January 2nd, interrupting my review of scholarship applications. Glenn stood on my porch looking haggard and desperate, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his confident demeanor completely shattered. "Dad, I need to talk to you. It's about my inheritance." I invited him into the study where Martha's photograph watched from its silver frame. Glenn collapsed into the chair across from my desk, his hands shaking as he tried to compose himself. "The house situation is worse than I told you. Fred didn't just trap us in debt. He made us liable for his entire company's obligations. We could lose everything we own, plus face criminal charges for participating in fraud." Glenn's voice cracked. "I need access to my inheritance now. It's the only thing that can save us." I opened the desk drawer and withdrew the foundation documents, spreading them across the mahogany surface like evidence in a trial. "Glenn, let me show you your inheritance." His eyes scanned the papers frantically. "What is this? Martha Miller Memorial Foundation?" "Your inheritance. Every dollar Martha and I accumulated over 40 years now helps families fighting cancer and students pursuing engineering degrees." I pointed to the beneficiary designation. "You receive exactly $1 to prevent legal challenges to the will." Glenn's face went white. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. You chose money over family, so I chose worthy recipients over an ungrateful heir. But this is everything. The house, the savings, the life insurance. It's all gone. All redirected to people who appreciate opportunities rather than taking them for granted." I leaned back in my chair, feeling profound satisfaction. The foundation has already helped more families in 2 months than you helped your own family in 2 years. Glenn stared at the documents like a man watching his future dissolve. "You planned this. You knew about Fred's troubles, and you let me walk into the trap." "I planned nothing. You walked into that trap yourself when you decided Fred Green's approval mattered more than 43 years of family loyalty." I picked up Martha's photograph. "She warned me about your changing priorities. I should have listened sooner." "Dad, please. I was wrong about Thanksgiving, wrong about Fred, wrong about everything. But I'm still your son." "Yes, you are. And as my son, you have exactly the same inheritance I received from my father. The opportunity to build your own life through honest work and sound decisions." I returned the foundation papers to their folder. Nothing more, nothing less. Glenn sat in stunned silence while the weight of his situation settled around him like gathering darkness. Outside, winter afternoon light faded over the lake where Martha and I had walked through 40 years of seasons together. The house, the debts, the legal troubles. You'll face them the same way millions of people face difficult circumstances every day, through personal responsibility and determination rather than inherited wealth. Glenn rose unsteadily and walked to the door, pausing at the threshold, like someone hoping for reprieve that wouldn't come. "I can't believe you destroy your own son this way." "I didn't destroy anything, Glenn. I simply allowed natural consequences to teach lessons that loving words never could." I remained seated at my desk, surrounded by papers that represented justice served and Martha's memory honored. You chose your path. Now you get to walk it. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. Through the study window, I watched Glenn drive away into the gathering twilight, carrying the full weight of choices that could no longer be avoided or postponed. Martha smiled at me from her photograph, her expression warm with approval. The foundation documents lay beside her image like promises kept, and justice delivered through patience rather than anger. Outside, snow began falling on the lake, where we'd shared so many peaceful evenings. Inside, everything felt complete and purposeful, and exactly as it should be. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.